Islamophobia is on the increase in Britain. British Muslims are being taken off passenger planes and accused of being members of ISIL. 21-year-old Ali Dharas and his two sisters, Maryam, 19, and Sakina, 24, were approached by a cabin crew member on an easyJet aircraft and asked to leave without explanation. They say they were questioned at gunpoint because a passenger claimed they belonged to the Daesh Takfiri group. Police officers said the claim was based on passengers seeing Arabic or "Praise be to Allah" on their phone, a point which has been denied by their brother, who believes female Muslims have been subjected to particular Islamophobic attention. Recently, the British public seem more prone to Islamophobic behaviour, especially towards Muslim women and children. Some politicians in the United Kingdom have expressed concern that the public have been influenced by the British media to think in these ways. Government terrorism policy has also been blamed for stirring up fears amongst the general public. Why is Britain not able to protect Muslim minorities? And who in the British media is to blame for Islamophobia? Simple questions with important answers. Now, those two young British Muslim sisters were recently forced off a British plane after a passenger falsely claimed that they were members of ISIL. They were interrogated for around an hour by armed officers. How would this religious persecution make the public feel? We asked them.
It makes me feel very sad that really there's this prejudice amongst, how shall I put this, most British people against Muslims, and this assumption that people, just because of the colour of their skin and their religion and their ethnic backgrounds, are likely to be terrorists. It makes me very sad, really.
I would feel that it was very unjust, but in the particular situation, I think there's an awful lot of false tension, and I think people need to calm down and look at people as people.
I think it's kind of disgusting, the rise of racism anyway, post-Brexit, this idea of otherness which is seen from people which don't bear the colour of skin deemed acceptable by society.
Well, to be honest, I think it sounds quite ridiculous. It's an unsubstantiated claim. There was pretty much no evidence, and obviously the hours questioning is pretty lightweight anyway if there's any genuine fear.
Well, I'd feel degraded, to be honest. I'd feel quite degraded. A lot of people are quick to sort of rush to judgment with things like this, but I think it's always important to, be sure of the facts before, jumping to conclusions. And it sounds like that sort of thing happened in that case.
I think I would feel a bit put out, to be honest. I'm a Catholic priest and it's fairly obvious, and I don't see a problem, nor with other people.
The recent case of the Muslim sisters being forced off a plane, interrogated at gunpoint, sadly is nothing new. That case, fantastically, that family were able to speak out. They were not fearful of repercussions, and they got their story heard. This is going on routinely against Muslims, not just in the last couple of years because of Daesh. It's been going on for nearly 2 decades now because of the new anti-terror laws that were enacted in the 1990s and noughties, and which we keep getting new ones every year. I think it's important to remember that this is not just religious persecution, it's a type of racist persecution that's been going on for other minorities for a long time, and the impacts are wide. Many people become extraordinarily fearful if they go through this. Other people become fearful of it happening to them. And all the time people become depressed, they get psychological problems, they become alienated, they don't feel they can participate in society. So the impact actually is very far-reaching and very wide. It's political, it's social, it's got health impacts.
The impact religious discrimination and persecution has on faith groups is truly detrimental, and its results can be adverse. And the reason why that is that any group, be it faith or race, who feel targeted, isolated, marginalized and criminalized, there's always that danger of a fringe element within this community who choose to voice their grievances in a manner in which is not conducive to social harmony. So whilst the Muslim community feel targeted, feel isolated, feel marginalized, attacked and criminalized, there could be, and there has been, a extreme minority from within the community who have gone on to adopt a fringe approach like violence.
The sister's brother says Muslim women are more likely to face Islamophobic hate crime in the West than Muslim men because the headscarf makes them more noticeable. How do the public think Muslim women in the West feel about this?
Intimidated. A bit unfair.
I'm not sure. Never really thought about it. I guess they feel targeted.
I can see why they'd be particularly aggrieved by it for no reason at all. I think they're being obviously segregated for their religious belief. You shouldn't broadsheet everyone with the same opinion. I believe in that quite firmly.
I think they may feel slightly threatened, in fact perhaps more than slightly threatened, but the other side of the coin is we tend to work on the principle of openness, transparency and so on, and you do need to see a face, if possible, but if they choose to cover their face, well, they cover their face. But I mean, how would they get on with bus passes and things like that? You know, that is a practical question.
Not very happy about it because it is their religion, their custom, and they wear it every day. Personally, I haven't got a problem with it.
It is sad, it's happening, but I think this is because it's something that media generates, and I think partly I think media should take the responsibility, as well as the politicians, I would say.
I would have thought they feel very badly. I would have thought the whole business of, what is it? Beachwear, hijab. I mean, it's so childish. It's rather sad for the French, of all people, who intellectually are probably the most superior educational system in Europe, have now reached those sort of depths.
The research work that Islamic Human Rights Commission has done over the last nearly 20 years has shown quite a lot of interesting findings. Before 9/11, if you're a woman and if you were young, particularly if you were wearing a headscarf, a hijab, you were reporting higher levels of anti-Muslim hatred. After 9/11, everything kind of evened out. Men and women were experiencing things at the same level, and it was a very high level. It was running at around 80% of people saying they'd experienced Islamophobia. Get to 2015, 2016, again, the vast majority of people are saying they're experiencing some form of anti-Muslim hatred. But there's a specific kind of venom that's kept for Muslim women, and if you look at the answers to our surveys where people are writing things that have happened to them, or when you overview the kind of cases that have been reported, you see that although men and women are experiencing this at the same level, Muslim women, and now they're being identified not just by wearing a hijab, it might be some kind of slightly different dress or being more modestly dressed than quote-unquote other people, or just frankly being of a different ethnicity, is marking people out as being or possibly being Muslim. And they're being attacked accordingly. And the form of attack is about attacking that idea of modesty. It's about either, if you wear a headscarf, pulling it off or throwing alcohol on it and defiling it in some way. Or if you haven't got something on your head, it's still about people feeling they need to touch you and to show you that this is how the Western world is. So you have a lot of hate attacks being reported where there's some actual explicit thing being said about how we're going to unveil you, or, you know, we're allowed to touch you, and this type of conversation going on. And it's quite extraordinary. If this was happening to European women, we'd be saying it's sexual harassment. But it's happening to Muslim women, or women perceived to be Muslim. And there isn't that much of an outcry. It's neither being called sexual harassment, and a lot of the time people are not really prosecuting it as hate crime.
Muslim women in Britain and Europe in general are clearly feeling immense pressure and the feeling of being targeted by a notion of a liberated woman imposed on them by secular liberal governments. And this notion of the perfect woman involves not being proud of their faith and not donning the hijab or the niqab. So with this pressure in mind, they do feel targeted, and they are visible targets for the rise in Islamophobia.
There's been a surge in Islamophobic hate crime in Britain against Muslim women and children. Why is Britain not able to protect Muslim minorities? The public said this.
I don't know. I feel that maybe some communities feel that they're being submerged a little bit, that the balance is not quite right in the community somewhere. and maybe they react accordingly. I think that social media too has a lot to do with it, a lot of spreading, a lot of unnecessary stuff.
For protection, you need to have a support of public backing, and sadly you have a 48% backing of probably protecting those rights of people, whereas you have a majority of, sadly, 51% of people that are, which is not stereotyping all of them, but there is a large amount of people that are not for protecting minority groups that aren't white.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's maybe become more prevalent, more reported. I don't think people have decided overnight that they're going to become Islamophobic. I think maybe it's just been more reported, more talked about, and it should be addressed. And I think people maybe have got more confidence in raising the issue.
Number one, I think the Muslim community is not as organised as other community. It doesn't have a one single particular voice, that sort of a pressure group like. And secondly, the politicians do not take the responsibility, as well as the media. And I think some might say the media has their own agenda. And yeah, I think it's a combination of all these factors.
I think the Brexit vote was not a right-wing vote, but I think the extreme right may well jump on the bandwagon on that, and we may find that not only here but in other European countries, the extreme right come more into the centre of the stage of politics, and I think that's probably going to happen in Britain.
We've seen a huge surge in hate attacks against minorities, Muslim communities particularly, but not solely, and women and children targeted amongst them. And the question about why is it that the authorities are unable to protect them is perhaps not the right question, because ultimately we've seen in the past that there's been legislation, there have been initiatives to protect some minorities against hate crime, rightly so. The question really has to be is why does the government not want to do this for Muslims? And actually, why is it trying to roll back even the things that were done for other communities? We at least had legislation for quote-unquote black communities. And although they weren't all that successful, they had made some difference. Now, even that's being rolled back. You're seeing an increase in the kind of persecution of black communities on the street by everyday people, and the kind of harassment by police authorities has also continued unabated, and in fact maybe has gotten worse. So these are the real questions now. When you know, everyday ordinary people of the majority, if they see the police harassing Muslim communities, black communities, gypsy communities, Roma communities, however you want to describe people, then they're going to think that that's a right and correct thing to do. They're taking their lead from the authorities.
Now, some may consider this response to be quite tongue-in-cheek, but this is the reality. One of the main reasons why Britain is failing to sufficiently protect its Muslim minority is because it's so hell-bent and adamant in causing mischief and chaos in the majority lands of these minorities. So you see this in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Asia, where Britain props up dictators, sells weapons, invades lands, occupies them, supports the state of Israel. So whilst doing all of this abroad, how can it ever succeed in protecting its Muslim minority?
According to the group Tell Mama, which measures anti-Muslim attacks, Muslims are suffering an explosion in faith-based hatred, with many women now afraid to conduct their daily lives, especially since the vote to leave the European Union. An annual survey found a 326% rise in incidents last year, while the Muslim Council of Britain group of mosques had recorded 100 hate crimes over a single weekend. Jeremy Corbyn recently said we must never pander to elements of the right-wing press which sow division in our society and demonise Muslim communities. Which personalities in British media do the public blame for Islamophobia?
For me personally, the more of the right-wing sort of broadsheets, if I'm totally honest with you. Obviously you've got a split spectrum of opinion between the papers. The papers are, I think, credible for a lot of the opinions that people believe in nowadays, especially the Mail. Sheets like that, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Well, it depends. I think it's the press, because the press make us look like we are the bad people when we are not. We're just like any other people.
Yeah. Yes, to a certain extent, and I don't think there's enough of the positive that going in that. If they do, it's a short. It's almost like a small, like in an article, you look at the back of page 5, and a small little paragraph. This person's done that for Muslim. But when it's something negative, we say Muslims have done the negative. But why can't it be a positive? Or we've got to be careful how we do our wordings and that kind of stuff. Yeah. For example, where the victims were. We know that paedophilia, and this is just an example, can happen from any race. It's not just Muslim men did it in Rotterdam. We've got different races, different cultures, and we need to make sure we're not targeting people. And it's got to be, media has to be fair and justice to everyone.
The media doesn't help. I mean, unfortunately, the BBC has now become, I've always been a great fan of BBC, but I watch the news at 10 o'clock or 6 o'clock, but it's now a provincial news. I mean, it really is not going, we have to go to other channels to get world news, which is a great shame, and they're not helping in any way on resolving the Muslim, the Jewish, the minor groups. It's a very unfortunate situation we're in.
That's a difficult one to answer. I actually work in the media, so I do understand how some of these things work, and you've got things like the Daily Mail and the Express are probably more vocal, put inflammatory headlines out. I think they are definitely could be held more accountable, certainly those two.
There are many key Islamophobic members of the commentariat. We could list them endlessly. The newer ones like Katie Hopkins, the older ones like Richard Littlejohn or even Melanie Phillips. But ultimately, I think the question is, how is it that people like this get a platform in the so-called free press? Free press doesn't mean everybody, however vile their thoughts are, get to have a say. A free press is about ensuring balance and fairness. And so this is the question we have to ask. There are many Katie Hopkins, there are many quite outrageous shock jocks on radio stations, etc. But why are they being given a platform? And they are ultimately only the more cartoonish or loud manifestation of this prejudice. You know, you will find it running as a deep vein in more subtle pieces of commentary from so-called respectable right-leaning commentators, as well as, frankly, even those who consider themselves to be liberal or left-leaning. And that's the key question. You know, there are things that we wouldn't accept, we would immediately see as being anti-Semitic or homophobic, which we're not picking up when they are anti-Muslim or anti-black. And this is a key thing now. We have to really start looking at the bigger picture, not just the individuals.
I don't think it's possible to pinpoint any specific individual or organisation to take the lion's share of the blame for the rise in Islamophobia. Rather, I personally believe the main perpetrators of Islamophobia becoming more mainstream is the mainstream media and the political establishment. And the likes of Katie Hopkins and Nigel Farage and right-wing groups are the inevitable byproduct of an environment of fear and scaremongering that's been created by the political establishment and the mainstream media. These individuals are merely the symptoms, but the root cause of this is the mainstream establishment, be it the media or the politicians.
The British government's anti-terror strategy is often condemned for driving a needless, unfair fear of Muslims. What does the British public fear will happen to Muslims in Britain in the future?
I don't know. I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I think it depends what kind of leadership we get from government, to be honest with you. I mean, it's slightly worrying to be trusting in the government too much, but I think if we get a strong lead that actually we should all be working together, then we're going to see much better relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. So, yeah, I mean, I'd be looking for strong leadership from the government and strong leadership from other faith communities as well. And I think I'm a Christian. I think the Christian community, by and large, has done quite well in promoting interfaith relations, but I'd be looking for more leadership from them as well.
I don't think it's promising, and I think that's such a horrible thing to say, and it's something horrible that I've accepted that I'm allowed to say that. It's like homosexuality, it's like black rights. There's progression, but it's never solved. Those divisions are very deep-rooted in our society since the colonial era, since this idea of white and others, and I feel it's not going to go away, not in the distant future anyway.
I hope nothing desperate. I think the government's got to be vigilant, but I don't think we want any panic activity. And I think in many parts of the country, I mean, I live in Luton, the Muslim community is no major problem. Relations are fairly good.
I would like to see them more integrated and more widely accepted.
The anti-terror laws have, year on year almost, created paranoia in the general public about Muslims, to the extent that maybe even 15, 20 years ago, people may not have liked Muslims, they may have had prejudices, but they would not actually be scared of them. Now we're almost at a point of hysteria. And when we're at that kind of point of panic in society, people start doing extreme things. We started seeing it after Brexit, and it wasn't just Muslims who suffered as a result. You saw all sorts of minorities being attacked violently. And what many of us fear is that we're going to start seeing that violence not only accelerate at the street level, but actually be turned into more structural policies. We already have kind of violence enacted by the anti-terror legislation, and the potential for that to go wider is there. Many years ago, there were conversations on the sidelines about internment camps and things like this, and when these questions were raised to politicians and policymakers, people actually didn't deny that, you know, these things hadn't been thought about. Now, it may sound alarmist, but, you know, only 20 years ago we saw concentration camps in Bosnia, and it's not very far away in the history of Europe that we had concentration camps and huge atrocities. We really do need to start looking, not just in the UK, but in other countries, at where this legislation is taking us, because it's allowing the scope for all of this to happen all over again. And when we have that kind of poisonous climate, where we have kind of levels of violence suddenly increase, and where we have a kind of very, very vicious discourse now at every level of the political and media conversation, we need to start worrying. There's still time to stop things going haywire, but that window of opportunity is closing very fast. And it's not just people in Muslim organisations who are worried. I think people are worried across the board and across European institutions as well. It's a kind of unspoken fear. As a believer, we pray that these things won't happen, but we also have to be realistic about the possibilities of them happening as well, and not ignore them because they're too scary to think about.
I don't believe Muslims as a community should fear anything. Fear and negativity and pessimism is not from the prophetic tradition. Rather, we should be optimistic and positive about our reality, especially as we know that our religion teaches us that verily through hardship comes ease. So with that in mind, I personally believe that with the ongoing problems that the community is facing, be it Islamophobia, be it the demonization and criminalization of normative Islamic concepts, I personally think this will wake up Muslims who are politically inactive and make them more assertive and confident in their views in defending their religion.
The British public may be awkward about admitting a rise in Islamophobia. They may also seem confused about the facts versus the fiction regarding Muslims and the difference between following a faith and supporting a terrorist group. But the facts speak for themselves. It seems Britain is struggling to accept Muslim minorities. Islamophobic policies often oppress Muslims, and a complex web of media strategies demonizes Muslims without much chance of challenge. Far from tackling prejudice and fear, Islamophobia is alive and well and thriving in the United Kingdom.